Leading off our discussion tonight, our Ambassador Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. Also with us, Ben Rhodes, a former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. He is an MSNBC political analyst. And Wendy Sherman, there is so much to react to in this G7 weekend. I leave it open to you to take your pick.
It's really, as I sort of said, half tongue-in-cheek. It was a doozy. I've been to several G7s, as has Ben, and this one was one of a kind. They treated him, the other leaders, with kid gloves because they didn't want to agitate what they perceive as really a child who could throw a temper tantrum at any moment. And your whole riff on tariffs is so true, Lawrence, because the president only looks, even though he said in his press conference today, he doesn't make any decisions on the basis of politics. All of his decisions are about whether he can get reelected. He looks at poll numbers and he looks at the stock market numbers. So first he said, I'm having second thoughts about China and tariffs because the stock market had tanked. Then his hardliners pulled him back. The stock market went down again. And then he said, well, we've gotten these late-night phone calls. Mnuchin corrected him, the Treasury Secretary, by saying they were communications. All of this has nothing to do with real life. This has to do with the President of the United States caring about what the Dow Jones average is and what his poll numbers are. And as you point out, going after everyone who has been a successful president or almost president in the case of Hillary Clinton. He goes after all of those who might defeat him, who might come and confront him for his whatevers.
I want to consider something that we've never had to consider before for a president, of any previous president attending a G7 or anything else, and that is the mental capacity of the president, the mental health of the president, possibly the mental deterioration of the president. And we're going to listen to him describing today his wife's relationship to Kim Jong-un. Let's listen to that.
I also say that, by the way, with respect to North Korea. Kim Jong-un, who I've gotten to know extremely well, First Lady has gotten to know Kim Jong-un, and I think she'd agree with me. He is a man with a country that has tremendous potential.
So, Ben, everyone there knows, and they probably knew when he was saying it, that Melania Trump has never met Kim Jong-un. White House has since admitted that. These leaders are watching each other. They're evaluating each other all the time. They have to deal with each other one-on-one. They have to deal with the group dynamics. What do you imagine it's like for the other leaders of the other countries who are there when they're watching him say things like this, which are completely false, that his wife has a good relationship with Kim Jong-un? What are they thinking in terms of the brain that they're dealing with when they're dealing with Donald Trump?
Well, Lawrence, I just wish that I'd known when I was in the White House that if we'd had the right whatever, we could have dealt with Ukraine. But, here's what I'd say. The leaders of those other countries are dealing with real problems, right? And I've been, like Wendy, I've been with Wendy at many G7s. I went to 8 of them with President Obama. That's usually where you sit down and roll up your sleeves and really deal with the challenges that are shaping the global environment. And now what they see in Donald Trump is someone who is completely incompetent to deal with those challenges. But importantly, he's also someone who has created almost all of the crises that are being dealt with at the G7. So the trade war with China that risks a global recession, created by Donald Trump. Iran resuming its stockpile of nuclear material, created by Donald Trump, pulling out of the Iran deal. Kim Jong-un, the person he lavishes such praise on, is still shooting off missiles in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. Climate change is accelerating in part because Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords, giving a green light to populists like the president of Brazil to go ahead and create a man-made crisis in the Amazon rainforest. So they don't have the luxury of kind of sitting here and reading the tea leaves and wondering what the reality show of the Trump presidency is. They actually have to deal with problems. And what I saw at the G7 is a G6 in which the rest of the world in year 3 of the Trump presidency is already moving beyond this guy. They're just trying to figure out how can we stop him from wrecking the summit so we can, on the sidelines, try to get something done. We're witnessing before our eyes, Lawrence, kind of the creation of the post-American-led free world. And that should really worry us because it's leading to some very real crises in many different parts of the globe.
Ambassador Sherman, or the G6, as Ben refers to them, are they just trying to hang on for the next 18 months and hope that our election night changes who they're going to have to deal with as the next president?
Well, I'd say two things, Lawrence. Sure, they're hoping that our election will change things and they won't have to deal with Donald Trump for another 24 years, another 4 years. But Ben said something really important, which is there are real problems that aren't going to wait for the next election. And these leaders have their own domestic constituencies. They have their own challenges. Boris Johnson, who seems to be a pal of Donald Trump's, nonetheless told Donald Trump publicly that the tariffs on China were going too far and that Great Britain actually sort of likes free trade and would like Donald Trump to get out of the way. Macron, whose own poll numbers are not so great, is trying to take over as the leader of the free world in trying to mediate a relationship with Iran to get us out of this incredibly difficult crisis that we are currently in. And poor Prime Minister Abe, who saw the president, even during the transition, really tried to build a relationship with the president. The president says, we've got principles agreed to on a free trade agreement. Abe had to pull that back a little bit. And most importantly, Abe knows that the missiles that Kim Jong-un is testing can reach Japan, even if they can't reach the United States. And he wonders why his good friend Donald Trump is abandoning him, because these missiles can't reach to Donald Trump quite yet. It is really a very fraught situation where these leaders are trying to solve real problems that won't wait out our election.
And Ben, clearly the Trump tariffs, which is one of the major tensions of this weekend, which the G6 are hoping they can do something about. It's the American voter that's going to change what's happening with the Trump tariffs as Donald Trump continues to see what those tariffs are doing to the people who he wants as his voters. It seems to me that's where this will change.
That's absolutely right, Lawrence. And let's face it, like as with the criticism of Obama, President Trump came into this office with kind of the worldview of a habitual right-wing media consumer. And he had this desire to get into a trade war with China. But he had no idea, Lawrence, where this was going to end, what the objectives were. To this day, when we're well into this trade war, we still don't know what Donald Trump is trying to achieve. And let's be honest about what we're facing here. The tariffs are taxes on Americans. Americans are paying more for goods because Donald Trump is levying these tariffs. Americans in key industries that he needs for his reelection, like agriculture, are being decimated by this trade war with China because the reprisals from China are really hurting American farmers. So what we're seeing, and I think what the Democratic candidates have to articulate, is Donald Trump's recklessness, the thing that everybody knows about him, that he's reckless, impetuous, and doesn't think things through. We're seeing the very real consequences of that day to day in the prices people are paying and the cost this is having on American sectors that are really important to our economy, and most importantly, to the potential recession that is coming. He inherited an Obama economy, and his reckless trade war could put us into a global economic downturn. And I think that that's what's worrying all these leaders, and that should be worrying Americans as well.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.